Hello, one and all. I'm Dan Asia, president of the Center for American Culture and Ideas. And we are the hosting body of what you are listening to, which is the Cultured Mind Forum. This forum brings, from 3 to 5 speakers every year to people across America to talk about culture, something that is sometimes overlooked because of the political age in which we exist. But today I have a wonderful speaker for you all. His name is Lincoln Jones, and he's the director of the American Contemporary Ballet. He has choreographed national campaigns for Facebook, Apple, and Virgin Mobile. He's also spoken on ballet for the Los Angeles Philharmonic and the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation at Cambridge, among others, and has served on the jury of the Los Angeles Film Festival. He is a recipient of the Philanthropy Roundtable Courageous Leader Award. And I suspect we will talk about what that means, being a courageous leader. He has designated our question and answer format as "We do not really dance." Lincoln, do you want to talk about what that means? And then I'm going to ask you a few questions more about your upbringing.
Sure. I think it means a couple of things. I think that our culture is suffering a little bit for a lack of a dance tradition. And I don't mean classical dance tradition, but more, when if we go back a little bit further in time, when cultures were more homogenous around the globe, usually dance was a big part of their cultures, and they had a dance tradition that they ascribed to and that people knew the dances. And I think that social dance is it serves a function in society, a cathartic function, a connective function that is really vital and very enjoyable, that we're kind of missing. America combines a lot of cultures, which in some ways is great, but in other ways, we're a little bit left to fend for ourselves in terms of finding ways to express ourselves and connect. Those communal structures just aren't there like they once were. And so I think that the way that we experience dance primarily in a widespread way in our culture are things like competition shows or TikTok, where primarily the idea is some sort of display, some sort of winning if it's a competition, and it doesn't really do the thing that dance is meant to do, I think, for ourselves, for our souls. And so, and I think this filters all the way up to classical dance. You see a lot of times with ballet, you see people performing very impressive things, but it's not with that impulsive response to music that we all know of as dancing. And the kind of dancing that we do as a culture is often very difficult. Um, I remember when I went to my first high school dance, I didn't know what I was going to do. So my sister said, "Here's some dance steps you can do." And then I had, a friend run up to me before we went to the dance and said, "Hey, what do I do when I get out there?" And there's this sort of idea that, you're supposed to go out and make up your own steps um, as you dance. And it's kind of intimidating, and it makes you very self-conscious. And so I think that in general, we're missing out because of that.
So you've mentioned a few things. Let's follow that up sort of with your biography, or a little bit more about you and dance, because you mentioned that of being a kid and growing up. Now, when I grew up, I took lessons in dance, in what you refer to as social dance.
Mhm.
Maybe you'd like to just give us the differences between what you ascribed as social dancing, and which has a communal function as well as a personal function, and what of course we refer to as the dance. That introductory word being very important. What's the difference between social dancing and the dance?
When you say the dance, or do you mean like classical dance, like ballet?
Yes, I think I mean that that's how we refer to classical
I
dance.
see. Okay. The difference isn't as big as people might think. And in fact, at the birth of classical dance, there wasn't a difference. At the birth of classical dance, if you look at like the 15th, 16th centuries in places like Italy and France, um, the people would have dances. They were social dances and they knew steps and they would get together. And for the nobility, because they wanted to look good and present themselves well. And also because at the time, there was a belief that if you moved awkwardly, there was something wrong with your soul. Your physical movement was considered a reflection of your soul. They really wanted to develop a beautiful style of movement. So they, started figuring out what contributed to graceful movement and how to teach it. And they would have ballet masters teach them. And ballet shares the same root word as ball, like a winter ball or something that you might go to. And they would all dance. And then eventually out of that came a professional class that did this for a living and started doing things that you could only do if practiced for 5 hours a day doing it. But really the at the base of it all is this idea of just impulsive response to music. And for social dance, it's really a remarkable and special thing. We live in a society, and in any society, you're constantly editing yourself, right? We don't go around like a young child would, just thinking or saying whatever we think or letting our emotions fly out in any way that we like. We're constantly sort of checking how should we behave. But in dance, you're supposed to do the opposite. You're supposed to actually let your movement move ahead of your mind and move in a way that is unedited. But it's done in a really positive way, which is I'm responding to music, which is already an organized, artful thing. And communally, I'm letting you see this side of me that I haven't practiced for you. It's just coming out. And that's kind of an amazing thing that we're actually taking away the editor. And I don't know in any other scenario in which we do this publicly or communally. And then on the professional side of that, the dancer is also supposed to do that. Now they've developed their body in such a way that it is the ideal of the ballet dancer is they develop their body to be a perfect instrument of the soul. So, if you or I at our age and whatever, practice of dance that we've done, we might hear a piece of music and have a tremendous feeling, but how it would come out of our bodies would not necessarily be exactly what we imagine to express our feeling for that music. The idea of a ballet dancer is to make their bodies be capable of that. And so in ballet, you have this tension between, on one hand, this very, very prepared, conscious thing that you've created, and on the other hand, an impulsive execution. And the further those get from each other, the more prepared you are, the more prepared your body is, and the more impulsive the execution is. That's when dance achieves a kind of transcendence. So the thing that a social dancer would want to feel and do is actually the same thing that a ballet dancer is doing, just on a much more extreme scale.
That's very nice. So certainly there's an analogy, of course, to music in all of this,
Absolutely.
which is to say that the performer, and we'll get to this in a minute. First of all, though, there are two things in dance. There are the performers that you mentioned, the dancers.
Hmm.
There is the choreographer, or
Hmm.
the person who has created the moves of the dance that the dancer is doing. And you're, of course, a choreographer. Now, in music, of course, we have the composer and we have the musician, the performer, whose goal is, yes, working 5, 6 hours a day so that they are in complete control of the music that they're going to play, so that when they play it, it can come out as if it is in fact improvised.
Yeah.
so that it has the immediacy, the emotional immediacy that carries the audience along with them. Now, you didn't mention the audience much, so, or you referred to it. What is the goal for the dance? I mean, it's going to be the same for the performer here. So the goal in dance to connect with the performer. What are we trying to do? What is the dancer trying to elicit, therefore, from the audience member or the audience?
Well, there's a story about George Balanchine, who is the premier choreographer of the 20th century, possibly the greatest choreographer ever in history. And this young choreographer came to him and showed him her work and was, asking what he thought of it. And I forget her name, but let's just say it's Melissa.
Hmm.
She goes to him and she says, "What do you think?" And he says, "Well, it's nice. It's very Melissa, but people don't come to the theater to see Melissa. They come to see themselves." And so I think the idea of dance, like any theater, is to have the audience see themselves in the dancer and the dancing, to feel just like we can hear music and feel the rhythms and everything very deeply and connect with the composer and the musician. I think we can do that visually too. So it's kind of a way to experience transcendence through someone else, um, to I think it's important to have beauty and to see examples of grace, because it's sort of a way of teaching your own soul what's possible, for itself. And I think that we learn things for our inner lives, our souls. I think we learn those through the physical outer world. And so by having art in these various mediums, theater, music, dance, they have different ways of teaching and dance is, it teaches a kind of nobility and grace and excitement, that is particular to it.
Hmm. So showing in some sense what we as humans are capable of expressing with our bodies
Yeah.
at the
Yeah.
highest form. So, Lincoln, how did you get into this? How did you start? What happened? I mean, most people say, oh, my mom got me into dancing lessons when I was 5 or 6 because she liked it. How did it work? How did it work for you?
The exact opposite of that, actually. My mom fought me. I know I was always fascinated by movement and people that did kind of extreme discipline, beautiful things with their bodies. And I didn't really have an exposure to ballet when I was younger, but I remember there was this was back when there was just television, and there was a frequent TV movie that would come on called Nadia, about the gymnast Nadia Comaneci.
Hmm.
And I would watch that over and over, and I was fascinated by the discipline of it, what could be achieved, and but I never thought of myself being in dance, just because I was a kid from Fullerton, California, a boy, that wasn't really a thing. And but then in high school, I saw that it was a possibility. You could take a dance class, and I wanted to do it. And I wanted to take dance and French, and my mom said, "No, you're taking choir and Spanish." Missed my head start. And then when I got in college, again, it was an elective, and I took it, and I met someone that said, you can do this as a career if you want to, which just blew my mind. And that was kind of it. I started very, very late. I started ballet when I was 19, or probably almost 20, and took it from there.
That's pretty much unheard of, isn't it? In
Yeah,
other words,
kind of.
almost everybody else starts as a young kid, right?
Yeah. Very occasionally you'll get guys starting late, not that late. I only know of one
Yeah,
other, but and then especially not kind of going into choreography and running a company, things like that.
right, right. Just for people who don't know, Nadia Comaneci was she Czech or
I
Hungarian?
think I want to say Romanian.
Romanian, but more of a gymnast.
She was a gymnast, yeah.
She was a gymnast, but you were intrigued by the movement of a gymnast because, well, that brings us to a good question. So, dance has had a complicated history and is formed of many different components, or was initially at least. I mean, I'm thinking of movement, of pantomime, that it also explores music, that it combines music. And as music doesn't necessarily need dance, but dance generally has needed music. It has all of those, and as well as so gymnastic qualities to it. You want to speak a little bit just about what that means or how you train for that or what all of these different qualities are? I mean, some people may think of dance just being the Nutcracker. Okay,
Yeah.
they've seen the Nutcracker or Swan Lake, but its history is very broad. I mean, I'm thinking now in terms of language also. I mean, the Baroque of music is very different from the classical and Romantic periods in terms of language style and the kinds of gestures that it demands or asks for. What about dance over its 400-year history or so?
Well, it's interesting you bring up the Baroque. So the ballets that you named, Swan Lake and the Nutcracker, are probably the two ballets that most people would name. But those are late 19th century ballets. There was a major innovation in 20th century ballet, which because it was more localized to New York, I think a lot of people still are unaware of. And the major innovation was this. Ballet had this sort of interesting gestation. It started out where ballet and singing and poetry and all these things would often go together into one giant evening of entertainment in the Renaissance and even the Baroque eras. And the kind of Baroque dance party, or even a Renaissance dance party, I would sort of liken it to maybe the Met Gala combined with a high school dance, like a prom. Um, and the dances would be like, if Daniel, you and I were of the nobility of France, maybe, okay, we're going to put on a ballet. What should the subject be? Well, let's make it Greek gods. And, you'll play Apollo and I'll play Dionysus or something like that. And it was kind of a lark, it's like everybody knows it's me, Lincoln, but it's fun to watch Lincoln play this role and it's fun to watch you play this other role. And our dance is really about themes. It's like, you're Apollo. So, maybe your theme is the sun and you're very proud. And maybe, mine's more wild or something like that. But then what happened is that the audience got bigger, right? It wasn't just the nobility anymore. More people, the middle class started growing and they wanted to be able to go to things like ballet and opera. And then those became people sort of thought of them as kind of the same thing in some ways, where, opera had a story. So now ballet has a story. And ballet was never really good at telling stories. Balanchine had another famous quote, which is, "There are no mothers-in-law in ballet." And what that means is there is no way to signify in pantomime, "This is my mother-in-law." You can say, "I love you." You can say, "I want to marry you." You can say, "You're beautiful." You can't say, "This is my mother-in-law." So from that, you can already sort of tell how limited in terms of being able to present a plot ballet is. So in the 20th century, Balanchine realized this. He realized that ballet was more like music. There was something called programmatic music in the 19th century, which is that, Berlioz has a whole idea of a sort of a cinematic series of events in his mind, and he gives you the program, and you're like, okay, here's where the witches are dancing, and here's where the guy's dying. But if you didn't have that program, you would never know what was happening, and it would just be music. To me, kind of a failed experiment. Same thing with ballet, is that ballet, you would have sort of some plot happening. There would be a prince and he'd say, "I love you" to the girl, and she'd say, "I can't marry you because whatever." And then everybody dances for a while. You basically find excuses for everybody to dance for a while. And the problem with us today being used to movies is we watch a ballet like that and we think like, okay, where's the plot? Why did the plot just slow down for 20 minutes while everybody danced? Back then, they realized the dancing was the point, and the plot was just giving it sort of a wrapping. Now, if we are presented with plot, we expect a good plot and we expect it to move. But Balanchine said, well, wait a minute, ballet is more like music. And, just like you can say Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, for instance, is very different from the Seventh Symphony. Now, can you say definitively what either one is about? Can you say what plot is happening? No. But there is an atmosphere that's so thick you could cut it with a knife in both. And in ballet, he started making essentially ballets with events, with atmospheres, but they were just more like poetry. And they were no less moving for it. In fact, they were more moving. They were entirely gripping, like listening to a gripping symphony, but with a visual layer. And that's kind of the big thing that happened in the 20th century and that made ballet much more watchable for audiences today.
Mm. So there's a guy named Roger Scruton, who I've read a lot, a philosopher. You know about him as well. He's one of the few philosophers, I think, who actually got art, who got dance, and who got music. Now there's a quote. He says, "Dance, to use Nietzsche's term, of course, Nietzsche, the 20th century philosopher, exists in an Apollonian version." You mentioned Apollo, which fully acknowledges and lends itself to the ideals of reason. That's the quote.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about that? Do you think he's responding as a philosopher and that it's true? Do you think that it's perhaps slightly an overstatement, that it's somehow a connection between reason? Because I think you would say, yeah, there's a lexicon of ballet that has, like Latin or Greek has some conjugations and declensions and standard, quote, terminology, unquote, right? That many dances have. Do you think it's a combination of reason and the body coming together in a very unique way? Or
Yeah, I think it just leaves one thing out. So there
yeah,
are, the ballet vocabulary is really just a way of delineating the movement possibilities of the human body in the cleanest, clearest, most fundamental way. Um, and in doing so, it helps one know how to move gracefully and also how to move clearly, so it's expressive. And so there is that, but I think that other thing that maybe you could call the Dionysian side is that the wildness of the human spirit. And it's when those two things come together, that impulsive execution that I mentioned versus the reasoned preparation, that maybe characterize ultimately the human experience, the two sides of humanity in a sense. That's what creates great dance. You could have very reasoned, perfectly executing robots, and it would be totally uninteresting.
boring as hell. Welcome to the AI world. I'm assuming we're going to get there.
Yeah, I may have fallen backwards into the only AI-proof field
At least for a while,
for a while. Yeah.
until there are robots that are but that's a whole nother question. But it'd be interesting to get into that at another point. So you mentioned this also previously, by the way. You mentioned the expression of the human soul.
Yeah.
I think you also put that within the context or an association with a moral sense. How does morality come to play in dance, if it does at all? And I make that, and I ask the question, I'll give you time to contemplate for a moment. Of course, we have a problem in the musical world, which is to say, composers can be liars and cheats and thieves and real jerks, Wagner being a great example, and write the greatest of music. Caravaggio was a murderer and one of the great painters of all time. Is there any relationship to art and therefore dance and the human being as a moral agent or not?
Well, I think you can be moral where art is concerned. For instance, if we think of morality as pursuing right actions toward a particular end, now we will often equate morality, the right and the good, with what is fair, and things that allow humans to live together. But you can be a bad artist by ignoring the practices that will create good art. For instance, I think art comes from a deep place. If you try to create it from a place of trying to just please people, or you try to create it from a place of expediency or something, then that would be, like, I would say, to use morality in the broader term, an immoral approach to art. So it could be that Wagner had a deeply moral approach to art itself in terms of developing his craft and giving it deep feeling, but while being immoral in terms of his relationships with other human beings in certain arenas. So I'm not sure, but as you say, I don't think that it takes necessarily what we might classify as a good human being, someone who is fair and kind and honest. Although honesty, I do tend to think that there is a relationship there. There's Winston Marshall, who was the guitarist for the band Mumford and Sons. And was ultimately had to leave the band because he recommended a book that was considered verboten, I guess, today. He said that one of the problems in our society today, with everyone trying to jump on everyone's words and take them out of context and twist them in order to make them a political enemy or a political pariah, is the fallout of that is that we censor ourselves. And he said, how can you be walking around through life censoring yourself and then walk into the studio and expect the ideas to just flow? So which I think is true. I think that it's very hard to practice dishonesty, although maybe it's possible for people that are able to compartmentalize very well. But I think it's probably difficult to practice dishonesty regularly and then try to get very honest with yourself to produce art.
Mm, nice. So that brings us to questions of art and politics. I'm going to get into more of that with you in just a minute, but I
Sure.
first want to just deal with a few other things. Dance was curious up until the time of labanotation, which for those who don't know is a way of writing down dance gestures and moves. Prior to that, it was done all as an essentially oral tradition, which is to say that dancers carried the dances in their bodies and then had their students replicate that the tradition is there in people's bodies. That's changed, of course, now, but how did that aspect of the way that dance was in fact given to the next generation, how did it affect choreographers? And how did it affect you, if it did in any way, as you were taught dances by those that said, and by the way, of course, this is true also in music to a certain extent. In other words, we have a score, which is written down though in this case, but can't in any sense give all of the information of what the composer wanted. So that we can say now, oh, by the way, when Schnabel plays this piece, oh, it happens that Schnabel studied with so-and-so, who studied with so-and-so, who, by the way, studied this piece with Beethoven.
Right.
So how does this work? How did it work in the dance world? This
Well, yeah, so Laban notation was a 20th century dance notation, but there were actual dance notations before that that have come and gone.
Mhm.
And there was a notation in the Baroque era. There was a notation in the late 19th century Russian era. And the reason that those notations came and went and that they're no longer taught today is that as the dance developed, they no longer could write down what was happening. Dance got much more aerial. The legs started lifting higher. It got much more three-dimensional. What started out as, I don't know if you, I think it was Arthur Murray. They would have like the little footsteps on the floor. Do you know what I'm referring to?
Yeah, sure.
So the earliest dance notation was just words. It was you do this step, then you do this step, then you do this step. Then it went into Baroque dance notation, which kind of looked like a fancy Arthur Murray. And then there's a sort of this period where dance developed and we don't know what it looked like. And then in Russia, there was actually quite a good system for what they were doing.
Mhm.
And but again, I think that music, as limited as music notation is, it's much better at capturing the whole thing than dance is. And the upshot of having it be primarily an oral tradition, which it is, you're correct about that, is that, it's kind of like a giant game of telephone. And, which obviously is not always successful. And so if you look at dance now, if you look at Swan Lake now, if you look at Sleeping Beauty, the Nutcracker, compared with the notations, which have been more recently discovered, there's now just a couple of experts in the world, or a few, that handful maybe, that can read that notation. And we've staged some dances from that original notation. It's very interesting because it looks much more like Balanchine, the primary choreographer of the 20th century. I used to wonder, where did Balanchine come from? He looked like he came out of nowhere. But no, he actually came directly from this tradition, and it's that tradition that got warped. Because, dancers might say, you get a star dancer who's going to say like, I want to do this on the left side rather than the right, or this is a little bit fast for me. I'd like to take this slower, or my leg goes higher, so I need more time in this particular section. And then that gets handed down to the next generation.
Mhm.
So for me, I got very lucky that video existed in Balanchine's time, because I saw his ballets live, staged by other people, danced by people that were not his students. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. There's more choreographic counterpoint. There's more steps. There's more invention in the steps. But it wasn't until I saw film of his dancers dancing it under him that I got it. And I thought, oh, I see what he's doing. I see what this is. And so very, very lucky that that happened.
Mhm. So you're saying Balanchine was very much a continuation of the Russian tradition. Is that, you would say that's
I
true?
would just say a direct continuation of the ballet tradition comparatively to seeing ballets that are now 125 years old or more danced today look very different than they looked. But
Mhm.
I now seeing how those ballets were actually danced after having staged them from the notation, I can see this continued lineage. And it has been a continual lineage. At first, it was centered in Italy, then France, then Russia, then New York.
Got it. Um, let's talk a little bit about, I mean, if you can explicate for us the difference between ballet and its continuation, let's say in Balanchine, or his students, and what is colloquially called, I think, or maybe academically called, modern dance. I mean, how do Martha Graham and Isadora Duncan find a place in the tradition? Or is it that they are in opposition to the tradition? What
So,
if people like Trisha Brown or Alvin Ailey or Merce Cunningham or Twyla Thorpe, who are dancers mostly of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, I suppose? I'm not sure I know enough about the dance of the last 20 years. Right? No, Mark Morris and a few others, and you, of course. So, how would you describe this? Is it a completely new lexicon? Is it um, a completely new, not just ethic, but aesthetic, in the same way that you would say the abstract expressionists kind of exploded former aesthetics of visual art? How should we understand this or try to grapple with this?
well, so my favorite quote about modern dance came from a philosopher, and it's um, it's more accurate than it might even seem on the surface. The quote is, "It's neither modern nor dance." And it's accurate in both senses, I think. What they were doing was, well, there's nothing really new. We reshape things in our own time, but Modern dance tried to throw out the bathwater and they threw the baby with it, I think, for the most part. And they tried to invent new vocabularies. They tried to sort of start over from the beginning, which, I'm sure dance, ballet at the time, which was the reigning form of dance, I'm sure there was plenty wrong with it. And in every era, we have to reshape it in order to remove what were perhaps errors or perhaps really were rooted to a particular time and place that aren't appropriate for our time and place,
Mhm.
and reshape it. But you can't really get anywhere by saying, okay, I'm starting from the beginning. What it means is you're going back to the beginning. Um, and I think that you really have to grapple with tradition in order to create anything that is like something new or really create a value. I think that modern dance came from an ethos in the 20th century of reinvention, which is good, but I don't think they were able to achieve much because of they didn't really grapple with the tradition in a proper way. I think that Balanchine created things that look much more strange, much more futuristic, much more unusual, and yet exciting. Whereas I think today modern dance is really on the decline because it was of a moment, but didn't really have the substance to last. And I think that um, particularly when it said that it's not dance, that's generally accurate. I mean, every dance creator has a different approach, but a lot of times with modern, the idea was some sort of communicative gesture. So it would be much more akin to like a pantomimic play. And if you watch like modern a Martha Graham or something, they tend to be like pantomime plays to with a background of music rather than what we were talking about earlier, which is this impulsive response to music. So, you know, um, these days, like when I was in college, one of the things they would encourage you to do is make the dance first and then add the music later. This is how like John Cage and um,
Bruce
Maurice
Cunningham.
Cunningham would work.
Yeah.
And you can do that and you might get some interesting accidents, but in terms of how we all experience dance, nobody goes out on the dance floor, starts moving, and then says to the DJ, hey, pick something that looks good to this. It comes from and in reaction to the music.
Uh, I have been to a good bit of dance over the last 15, 20 years. There are occasionally dances without music. What do you think of that is it viable to create dances without music, or is there always something that is actually heard, although not heard by the audience and or by the dancer, the choreographer? How,
Well, I mean, to get into the sort of finer points of this,
yeah.
I suppose, if you're in your living room and you're imagining a piece of music, you could move to that, but the music would be in your head. If dancers are supposedly dancing together, we can't hear what's in each other's heads. So I think dance comes from a sense of rhythm. Now, I think that part of the problem comes in the word dance. I think it's not often well defined. And people think that any sort of like physical, gestural movement that happens in a sequence is dance. It may be something, but it's definitely something different than what happens when we hear music and feel that we need to scratch the itch of moving to what we feel. So, now if four of us get together and we clap out a rhythm, that's a form of music. It's maybe a rudimentary or simple form of music, but a lot of early primitive or tribal dance happened in those contexts, and some of that dance got very complex and very good. But I think that the idea that it's silent and I'm dancing to silence, I don't think that's dance, or at least it's something very different from the experience of hearing music and wanting to move to it.
Hmm. Okay. Um, you mentioned something nice. I'd just like the audience to understand. So when I was growing up, I'm a bit older than you. Boulez, who was very important in the musical world in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, said that really the past is no longer important. In fact, we wish to start from ground zero. Now, he was of the generation who witnessed World War II, the excesses, that's a word that doesn't cover what happened, but they wanted to break from the romantic tradition that came before the war. Most of us realized that that was an untenable position, that it's impossible for human artists, for artists, only humans are artists. I don't think monkeys are, or elephants. Can't break themselves off from the tradition. We are informed by our predecessors. We're informed by everything that they did. You would say, that's what you're saying, that this is also true of dance, that you can't negate the past. You can't try to create a new definition of dance without somehow exploding the whole notion of what dance is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the idea to start totally new, I mean, that concept, the impulse to do that could come from a number of places. I suppose it could come from, the idea that something like a war, horrible happened, and we've got to not do that again. But those that don't know history are doomed to repeat it. It could come from just, the grandiose spirit of the artist saying, I want to reform the whole universe. But I think that, do you really want to erase Bach in your ability to create something good? I think that artists need material. In fact, I think that Stravinsky and Balanchine, but in a per music context, Stravinsky had it right. Stravinsky and Balanchine both liked to work from limitation. Stravinsky wouldn't start a piece unless you told him exactly how long it was going to be. Is it a minute 10 seconds or is it a minute 11 seconds? And I think that artists do best when they have limitations to work within, because you can't just start from the ether with nothing. You have to throw something out there to then start some material to then start playing with it. So I think that I think that my personal theory on a lot of this is that you have Beethoven, who's this, wasn't totally understood in his own time and did something pretty new, at least seemed new, but it was heavily within the tradition. And, after that, or you could pick any number of revolutionary artists. And after that, the revolution itself becomes the ethos, and everybody wants to be the next Beethoven or the next person that's going to do the next big thing. And I don't think that art really comes from that place. And I think that throughout the second half of the 20th century, you have a lot of artists thinking that the way that art works is you walk out into a field, open up your mind, and boom, the symphony comes. And I think that the way they did in the Renaissance, with like painting, for instance, is much more productive, which is that you have to paint exactly like this. And you have to paint like your master, and you have to copy and be able to do what your master says. And then eventually, after a while, you'll start to strain against those limitations. And that straining is your own personality, and it's your own contribution to the art. But it comes after sort of absorbing everything that came before. I think that we're seeing this like, do you know Alma Deutscher?
I do not.
So Alma Deutscher, are you familiar with the recent sort of rediscovery of Partimenti
Yes.
music?
Yes.
So this probably going to get too technical for a general audience, but the short version is they've sort of rediscovered how the great composers, Bach, Vivaldi, Mozart, who were able to write so quickly, were trained. And it's very different than how our music students are trained today. And after this rediscovery, sort of the first very talented child to go through it is this young girl named Alma Deutscher. You can YouTube her.
Oh, yes, I know of her, of course, of course.
And she's able to essentially improvise in sonata form. And it came from what that training system is just ingesting musical models over and over and over and over again. And it's not attractive, it's not something kind of training, when somebody goes, what's the secret to making great art? And you say, well, it's going to be about 100,000 hours of toil. Nobody wants to hear that, but it's kind of what does it.
Well, but that's what it is. Now, we have a question from someone in our audience, which is more professionally related. What's the key to succeed as a ballet dancer?
As
And
a
dance
ballet dancer,
with accordance to art, yes. And don't say practice, practice, practice.
you
That's
say
too.
with accordance to art, like how to be a successfully artistic.
I think that's what the questioner is asking. He or she may get back to us if we're not right on track.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say number one, get very good training because ballet is built on muscle memory and repetition. So the better that can be, what you're ingesting, the better it is, the better you're going to be able to put out. And then the key to successfully being, I think, a ballet artist is being willing, number one, doing that preparation to the umpteenth degree so that your body immediately responds how you want it to respond. So your body responds unconsciously the way you want it to respond, so that you are then free to just give yourself over completely to the music. And this is where a lot of ballet dancers, when ballet is boring, it's usually because they're not doing this. It's usually because they're being careful, they're making sure that their poses are correct, that they take their time to get into balances, and that everything looks nice and pretty and neat. Ballet shouldn't be perfect. It should be compelling. And that comes from being willing to give yourself over to the music in a way that feels much more dangerous. But again, that also takes massive amounts of preparation.
Right. Practice, 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 practice.
Yeah.
So let's talk briefly. We have about 10 more minutes.
Mhm.
So, for better or worse, you have entered the political realm. My guess is it's not something that you wanted to do or that you intended to do at all. Politics has always been present in the arts, whether it's the French Revolution and the change that it brought about in dance and all of the arts as they moved out of a system controlled by the nobility, or Napoleon then taking over as emperor, or in our the previous century, it's not the present one, but the creation of democracies and social democracies and communism. So we know that these things have affected artists and therefore affected artistic output. Do you want to describe just a little bit more about your encounter with the politics that you described with the musician who couldn't stay quiet, as it were?
Well, talk more about Winston or about my
No,
experience.
about your experiences in this.
Yeah. So I remember in when I was actually first starting the company in LA,
Which is when?
that was around 2011, 2012.
Uh-huh.
Sometimes people would come up to me after a talk and say, you should phrase something this way, referring to a more politically correct way of saying something, or you shouldn't talk about this, or I'm so glad to see your company is so diverse, or your company's not diverse enough. It was these things that I hadn't ever heard before. Not that I was unaware of them and political trends, but it was people were coming and saying these things. And then I remember there was they were considering making a law in France, and I don't know if they ever did, but it had to do with the weight of fashion models, that they couldn't be under a certain weight. And the weight that was being proposed was higher than some people naturally are. So it would actually require models to gain weight in order to be allowed to work on the runway or something. And that pricked my ears up because I thought, if this can happen to models, this can certainly happen to ballet dancers. And with ballet, there's a reason for having a slender physique. You can actually see the motion better. So then in 2017, a grant that we were to renew came with a DEI requirement, which was that I was to begin hiring with preference to race and programming with preference to race. So I didn't sign
Let me
that.
interject just so people know, DEI means diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Right.
Almost all universities have many DEI officers in many different areas around the university. Sorry to interject. Go
No,
ahead.
no, it's fine. And the idea wasn't that you were supposed to, accept or be willing to consider anyone, regardless of their race. It was sort of the opposite. You were supposed to give preferential treatment to certain dancers because of their race. And I knew I couldn't do that for several reasons. Just to me, it doesn't feel right to treat someone with their like some sort of physical identity ahead of them as an individual. Um, and uh, and I couldn't imagine trying to like hold this second standard that was a non-artistic standard for the company. But and I remember, you know, things getting just more and more heated, more things you couldn't say. And then in 2020, I don't know if you guys know what the Black Square is, but there's this big thing in the arts world that you were supposed to post a Black Square on your Instagram. This was after George Floyd, not in support of George Floyd, but in support of Black Lives Matter. And I saw several problems with this. Number one, Black Lives Matter was a group that was had some very extreme political positionings, depending on like LA Black Lives Matter said they were for like the disbanding of the nuclear family and they wanted to abolish the police, right? Both ideas I thought were not something I was going to advocate for. And secondly, uh, we weren't a political company. So the idea of, when the dancers were hired on, they weren't hired on because they liked my politics. They were hired on because they were good dancers. And so it was certainly not my prerogative to turn around and say, this is what this company believes. I mean, can you imagine, Daniel, if you joined my company and you're a Lakers fan, and I say our company is for the Yankees, you might drive you crazy. So it's and the last part of that was that I didn't. For me, art is for coming together. Politics, I think that fundamentally we're pretty much a lot the same humans. And that's one of the things that art is really good at is we can share things that we find funny, that we find moving. But when it comes to politics, politics are the figuring out of how we make society work. So, and there's big disagreements over that, right? Some people think that there should be big taxes. Some people think there shouldn't be big taxes. And so politics is where a lot of us divide. So the art, I think, is where we're together. And then when it comes to the how do we do things, we divide a lot. And to bring that sort of topical divisive layer into art would be to defeat the purpose. And furthermore, I thought, okay, so we're going to post about this George Floyd who died. There's been a lot of tragedies. I mean, like there's been school shootings, there's been natural disasters, there's been wars. So now, how are we picking and choosing which things we're supporting and posting about? And if we're even doing a small amount of what's going on, then we're now just throwing this in the face of everybody when they need something that takes them out of it and brings them back together. So people didn't like that, kind of got crucified on social media for a bit, lost a lot of funding, but couldn't get rid of me. So still here.
So I think a bottom line in this may be that you really think that art should do its best not to enter the realm of politics, that it's a separate realm that does things for human beings that's vastly different than what happens in the political realm. Is that a fair assessment?
I
Is that okay
mean,
if I say that?
I mean, I think that where you might run into a little bit of nuance is what somebody might consider politics. So for instance, does somebody produce a play about human freedom in a country that's heavily dictatorship? Is that a political statement?
Mhm.
Maybe, but it's really about, igniting people's desire to be free. But to say, hey, this candidate versus this candidate, or we're just lampooning somebody, then it's, there's probably a place for that, but I think the really hefty, substantial art that we need and value as a society goes way deeper. And I think that to bring that layer in can do it a disservice.
Yeah. So this is just a one-off question. It's a tough one. I
Yeah.
know what I would respond for a piece that sort of changed the 20th century notion of music. But what's one of your favorite ballet dances? If somebody says, "Hey, Lincoln really likes this. I'm going to go watch a video of it."
Yeah.
What should they go see?
Well,
Anything?
dance on video is hard, but
Okay, or live.
no, I'll give you one. I'll give you one that you can watch on video. I would say try to get a version from the 60s, but this is not the one. It's probably not the most impactful for the 20th century, but a ballet called Concerto Barocco, which is a Balanchine ballet to um, Bach's double violin concerto. And if you can find the video with Suzanne Farrell in it,
Mm,
uh, that's something.
beautiful. And then finally, this is going to close this up, at least for our official version. We might have a few questions. It's fun to talk just for a few minutes if you got another 5 minutes.
Yeah,
But
I'm fine.
want to listen on. So we started with talking about the difference between classical dance, the ballet, and social dancing. And this person says, can you talk about the consequences of American society lacking forms of social dance? Do you think this negatively impacts us?
So it's interesting. I actually, when I was at the Roger Scruton Foundation, I met a woman who was a culture writer, and she was from Virginia, and clogging was in her background. She loves clogging. And she said she thinks our culture is so sex obsessed because we don't dance. And the thing that people are seeking in sometimes misdirected into sex is this communing that happens when you dance with somebody. And I think that I think that one of the bigger things is having a lack of a shared tradition. I mean, even among, like, you see sometimes with immigrant families, the kids will kind of be brought up in a very different world from the parents, so they don't have that, shared tradition. And, I was a hellraiser when I was younger and probably still a little bit today. So I'm the one who's usually breaking tradition or breaking bounds, but I do see the value in having traditions and practices and things that bind us together. And I think particularly in dance, I mean, it does so many things. There's a type of dancing called contra dancing, which is it's kind of like square dancing, but from England. It's where square dancing came from, where you have a series of moves and everybody knows them so well. It's like 10 moves that you have a caller kind of calling them out. Now you're going to do the star. Now you're going to do the in and out. I don't know the names of them are. But you end up winding down a line and dancing with everybody in that line. And there's just something about spinning around with somebody and watching that joy in their faces. Like, now what is our communal activity? Like pissing each other off on Twitter, as opposed to this, just you see the best of people when they're dancing, I think. And you get to know people and in a deep way. And so I think that's what's missing. And if there's anything that I can do with my career, like if I can bring dance into society like that back in a big way, that would be, I think, the greatest achievement.
Very nice. Lincoln Jones, I thank you very much for being with us today on the Cultured Mind Forum.
It's a pleasure.
I've enjoyed this a lot.
You too.
So, anybody now, this ends our formal talk time, as it were. So, if you'd like to sign off, you're welcome to do so. I'm just going to chat with Lincoln for a few more minutes, just about a few things. You're welcome to continue on with us.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and I wonder if I could jump in now, really quick, just a question for Lincoln, since
Yeah.
we're the class that I teach, the Human Achievement class, I tell my students that the history of art is overwhelmingly religious, right? Particularly the visual arts, of course, but what do you see a relationship between the religious world in today's world of dance and you know, and how we understand dance in contemporary times. You know, so for instance, let me just say I'm a product of the 80s. So Footloose was a big, you know,
Yeah.
influence on me. So there seemed to be like you know, an antagonism between the religious sensibilities and the kind of the ecstatic social dancing that we understand it. So is there a way, and in my class, I started off, I show people the Shiva Nataraja, right? And I say, you know, the lore of the dance and the Hindu tradition that, you know, the human being is centered, because we talk a lot about the spirit and the soul, obviously, in the beginning of this. But do you see a relationship even today between religion and contemporary dance? Or
Um, I mean, I think that you know, there are some cultures that are heavily religious and have a heavy dance tradition. Like Israeli dance is a huge thing. It's both practiced in Israel and like at our local Jewish community center, they have like a dance night, and it's this very, very specific tradition that has actually sort of morphed and accepted pop culture, where they use sort of influences from popular or even like music video style dancing and and music, but with the sort of forms, the circle forms of more traditional dancing. But I think that the thing in Footloose is that, you know, there are religions which I think insist on a great deal of control, like a cult would be like the highest version of that. And definitely the father in Footloose, he was sort of this pastor who, you know, through the pain of losing his son, I think it was, or losing a child, he really was trying to keep a tight grip on everything. And I think dance is the antithesis of keeping a tight grip. So, you know, if your religion is based on sort of an ecstatic worship, then I think the dance is usually a very big part of it. If your religion is based on a lot of subservience and control, it might be a different type of dance. It may be a more subdued dance, or maybe not at all. But I think that for the broader question of not just religion but spirituality, I think dance is absolutely essential, because it really, you know, I think that there are probably few people that would associate spirituality with like the really reasoning frontal part of the brain. We usually feel it as something deeper, and dance is the best way I know of tapping into that. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
no, it does. I mean, just because in our textbook that we use, we go into the ethnographic beginnings of dance. John Wilson, who again was the co-writer, used to teach the class with us, really put forth this idea of the ecstatic dancing and the religious experience and its relationship to society. You touched on it in the beginning, right? This the court dancing, and
Yeah.
why dance was so important. And it just strikes me as, you know, I just wonder when people go and dance, where do people dance now? Weddings, right? That's generally a sort of religious or even quasi-religious thing. They dance at ceremonies, right? And I just think I just wonder, I'm always looking for the strands of kind of like the beginnings, of the religious and ethnographic beginnings in the contemporary time of whatever we do, dance, art, doesn't
Yeah.
matter.
There's I'm trying to remember his name, but there was an early writer about dance. I think he wrote a lot in the 30s about the ethnographic beginnings of dance. And he divided dance into essentially two categories. And I forget what his names for them were, but one was a dance that followed more of a choreographic pattern, and one was the more ecstatic dance where you would find people like shaking on the ground with their eyes rolling into the back of their head and things like that. And you know, it's and I guess my argument is that it's when those two things come together that things are really good. But I think that dance, you know, because of its communal nature and because of its ecstatic nature, it naturally goes with things like celebrations, which a lot of ceremonies are celebrations. But even more somber things like funerals or whatever have usually have a choreographic element to them, where you're walking like, or like a bride's procession down the aisle, you know, walking slowly to give the gravity of the moment. So I think that one's way of moving is often heavily integrated into traditions.
Right. Great. Thank you for that. That's
Yeah.
great.
So I'll simply close by asking you to remember that Balanchine had Stravinsky. who in fact do you have? Right? In other words,
This is my constant search. So, you know, one composer that probably did not achieve a lot of widespread popularity because he went against the grain stylistically, but was really good at writing dance music was Charles Warrenen, who just died a year or so ago. But he sort of stuck with a semitonal, semi-12 tone thing when the trends in music moved away from that, but really, really a good rhythmic writer. I am working with Alma Deutscher on something, but I think that one of the problems is that I think minimalism still exerts a major influence on a lot of composers, at least that I've heard more recently. And that's sort of the antithesis of dance music, because it doesn't have the topography of a score that makes you want to dance. You know, I think minimalism is really good. Like Philip Glass is really good for seeing in a movie and watching a vista too, but it doesn't make you want to move. And so something I'm always searching for.
good, we can help with that.
Okay, great.
We should stay in touch with each other about this. Lincoln, it's been a great pleasure. I'll close with a joke.
Okay.
Is when people ask me, what's your name? I always say, it's Asia, like the continent. And I have to tell you, when I first confronted you, I couldn't remember, is his name Lincoln or Ford? Okay, but so I want you to understand, but now I know and I've got it, and it's Lincoln Jones, so I am all set.
It's Lincoln like the Continental.
Exactly. Exactly. Lincoln like the Continental. And you're a bit too young for this, but look at the cover of Alan Sherman, the comedian's first album. I'm sure you can find it. He was a wonderful comedian, and you'll understand the reference to you and now how I can keep this straight.
Sounds good.
Thank you so much. We'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye bye,
Great.
Lincoln.